Hello and welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I know it's been a while. I hope to pick up the pace a bit in 2026. But today I have a very special episode for you. I have an interview with a special Vedic teacher, a teacher of Vedic Chanting, Shantala, who actually is based in Lugano, Switzerland. We'll talk about that on the podcast and all of the interesting synchronicities and serendipities about Vedic studies in Switzerland. And she has a platform called Veda Studies.com. So while I actually had her on the Indian Religions podcast on the New Books Network, it's really off the beaten path for the New Books Network because we talk about her beautiful books that are designed for practice, for mantra practice that you may well be interested in. And the podcast is really um, pitched at the intersection of traditional Vedic learning, modern online Western pedagogy. Really, what she's doing is very much parallel along the lines of what we do at the Indian Wisdom School, and also very unique in its own way. And we talk about her own unique journey and a little bit about her unique pedagogy. And of course, there are learning opportunities to study with Shantala, to study traditional Vedic mantric recitation online. So please enjoy this very special edition of the Indian Wisdom Podcast. You know how to find me if you need me, rajbalkaran.com, indianwisdomschool.com, or just email me. Namaste. Hello, and welcome back to the New Books in Indian Religions podcast, a podcast channel here on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. More importantly, I have the pleasure of welcoming to the podcast today Shantala Sriramaiah, who is a teacher and founder of the Veda Studies platform. We'll be diving into what is essentially a prayer prop, a prayer manual, a list of Sanskrit prayers and hymns. We'll learn more about that. This podcast will also, of course, be cross-posted to the Spiritual Practice and Mindfulness channel, as it is a little bit off of the beaten path for most of our monographs and chapters, but well within the world of all things Indic and the glory of South Asia. So, Shantala, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raj. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours. We would love to hear a little bit about, your journey. You founded this really, really fascinating. We love publications, but also we cover almost all things online developments in the field of Indian religions, Indian studies. And so I would love to hear something about your journey into launching this platform.
So how long have you had? How long do you have?
I am a scholar of the Puranas, so take as long as you like.
So I actually never imagined that I'd, create such a platform or even be teaching, recitation of Sanskrit hymns and Vedic chants. And I never imagined, even though I was born into a family that is the main dharma for us, our main sort of, pravritti, our foremost occupation is to create spaces and share the knowledge of chanting and prayers. So my mother was also a teacher, and she taught in our living room, and she taught in all of these big cultural institutes in Bangalore, my hometown. And so I sort of grew up, under her nose, going to her classes. I learned the entire Lalita Sahasranama, Devi Mahatmyam, all of that. She was such a great devotee of the Devi, and she just lit up every year during Navaratri. It was her time, and she was invited everywhere to teach the Devi Mahatmyam, but also to do the Parayana, all of that. So she was, it's all the stuff I learned from her. And so when she passed, by then I was living in Europe, I was in Brussels, and I was in tech. I'm an engineer, so like literally no connection. But when she died, I sort of did this 180 and I said, I have to continue my family legacy in my own way. And so I quit my job in tech and just with no network. I didn't know anybody outside of my, tech network at the time. And I said, okay, I'm going to start teaching chanting classes. I had no audience. And it was just this really deep longing. I could not explain it. And so I started with a tiny website and a small Facebook page, and just with the yoga community locally, and just started very, very small, just teaching little things. And I never thought it would grow into a big platform and that I'd have students, in over 60 countries now. And so it's a very modest beginning, very difficult, because who wants to go to a chanting class that is traditional, without music, not entertaining? I was trying to teach people Sanskrit as part of, the pronunciation, ucharanam, all of the swara, matra, balam, that sort of rigor in the Sanskrit recitation. And so it was a really difficult sort of path I chose, I think, to teach a very traditional form, also because I didn't know any other form. So I grew up very immersed in very traditional form of recitation where our entire sort of focus was on maintaining the integrity of the Sanskrit texts. And so we did not sing the prayers, and we recited it following chandas, prosody, and we followed, and with Vedic chants, we follow all of the swaras, the matra, balam, sama, santanaha, all of those, hundreds of little rules. And we also teach these rules. And so it's a very boring class for those who are looking for relaxation and bliss. And so that's how I started. I said, I'll just stick with what I do, what my family does, and what my Guru Parampara is offering. And so when my mother passed, my father, took me to my guru and said that if I was going to teach, then I needed to be supervised and be guided. And so that's when I started studying with the Chalakere brothers, my guru, M.S. Srinivasan. And so he's been my guiding light in really just constantly telling me, just do what you do. And, it's the only way to grow. It's the only way to offer what we do. And so here I am, about 13, 14 years later. And now it's a bit of a platform now. We're still small, we're still modest, but we have, I think, a very rich community of serious learners, for which I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, there's so many fascinating vignettes that you've shared there, and there's so many parallels. I mean, it's so intriguing. I love the leaning into tradition. You've been blessed with being with access to lineal training, and I love the innovation. I love the sort of this beautiful synergy, and I can quite relate to it. The synergy of the respect for the maintenance, the maintenance of rigor, at least in a traditional sense. For example, in terms of chanting mantras with swara, chandas, etc. But yet while the topic and the pedagogy is quite traditional, the studentship is not. And I love this sort of this alchemy of where sort of ancient Brahmanism meets the global village. Yes, and it's so interestingly enough, there's a parallel to that in what we do with Indian Wisdom School. Much of my training is traditional, but I draw mostly on scholarship, draw on various methods, literary theory. If we're looking at excerpts from the Puranas or the epics, etc. But the idea that there is globally, there are so many individuals who are very, very much interested in and even have an aptitude for these extraordinarily niche traditional Indic paradigms. I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it?
it's beyond, it's just mind-bending for me to think about having students, who are in Hawaii and who are in Japan and, don't come from the tradition. I also have many, many Indian students, of course, but we have students everywhere. And it is astonishing that it's as if we're all coming back to something we've left off, right? And there's this coming together, and everyone's so engaged, and everyone wants to learn correctly. And we also have a teacher program, and I can see the engagement. Everybody wants to teach and honor the tradition and just be passing on, be part of this, this nitya stream, as I call it, which is, this perpetual stream of prayer that has always been. And people want to pass it on also in a correct way. And they put a lot of effort into it. There's a lot of practice going on, which is it's very beautiful to witness. And I'm very grateful that somehow all of this has come together. And this, what you spoke about, there's something very old, and there is this innovation. As I know, my good fortune would have it, as part of my tech background, my expertise was really developed in learning and development. So it was HR technology that I specialized in, and really my area of expertise was learning and development and the dissemination of training within large organizations. And so I really did a lot of online dissemination of, corporate sort of learning programs and measuring its success and measuring its effectiveness and things like that. And not that I use all of it, but I think that there's something that I took from there and applied to disseminating, ancient chants and stotrams and Vedic mantras. And I also have a little methodology there because I wanted to find what's the fastest way to get somebody from not knowing Vedic mantras to being able to practice them without that whole acquiring a PhD in Vedic Sanskrit and spending years and years and years on that. And so I developed this methodology. Again, I think it's my engineering background where we're constantly sort of, we have this eye on design and on, just being efficient with operations, how to accelerate things through design. And we apply the same techniques in learning as well. And so that's what I tried to figure out always. And I try to get people, it's very learner focused. And so all of the courses are very learner focused. How can I get people to learn Rudram in the most efficient way? It's a very difficult, long chant, long learning process. How can I get anyone to learn it? That was my whole sort of design behind creating Veda Studies.
Well, really individuals like you and I ourselves are intersections of East and West in terms of training and temperament and heritage and vocation and location and all that. And so I think it's unsurprising that we would draw on the best of both worlds. We would draw on the elements which have perfected and preserved these traditions, and also draw on the elements which allow us to serve a broader audience. I mean, it's intriguing in that I had great pedagogical instinct and training over the years, and I did all kinds of teaching. But I had no tech training or marketing, sales, any of that stuff. I mean, for me, it was just, I finished my PhD and it was sort of a stopgap so I can continue to teach while I was trying to deal with the somewhat fraught academic job market, particularly in South Asian studies, perhaps. And really, I mean, a decade later, online teaching apparently is what I meant to do in addition to in-person teaching. And hilariously, actually, I was just coming back from this teeny tiny place in Italian-speaking southern Switzerland, doing a retreat there, and I was on I was literally on the train in Lugano, which is this less teeny tiny place, somewhat better known, but still teeny tiny, in southern Switzerland. I was on the train in Lugano, headed down to Milano Centrale, the central station in Milan for those listening. And of course, you could literally get on a train and cross a border without a hitch. You're on the same train. It's hilarious. Unheard of in North America. Uh, and my one of our dear community members and someone who helps at the online school, Nikita, he's messaging me at this very time saying, "Hey, I should have thought of this earlier, but I know this great Vedic teacher in Lugano. Maybe you can meet up with her." I'm like, "That'd be fantastic." Except I just left Lugano 20 minutes ago. I'm on the train. And so there are all these little threads, but it's interesting. I mean, who would think that I'd go to southern Switzerland to teach, to do a teaching retreat on, in that case, it was the Devi, the Indian goddess, whether it was chants or whether it was some of the narratives from the Devi Mahatmya, some of the philosophies. And it's staggering to me that there are people who are really interested in and ready for what we would think of as advanced training, whether that's in a sort of emic traditional paradigm or even in a graduate study level at the academy. They're very much interested in and have the aptitude for advanced training, and they're doing it just out of sheer interest. It is. I joke with them that this is the Kali Yuga because all of the Indian people are doing STEM and all of the foreigners are taking up the Vidya. So here we are.
That is
Anyhow.
hilarious. Yeah, that is really funny. And I mean, indeed, there's so many threads that seem to have brought us together. One, of course, shout out to Nikita for introducing us. And then, since there's also been, a message from my friend, just completely out of the blue with a picture of your book, the stories behind the poses, and asking if I knew the author, and and I was like, hey, guess what? And indeed, and I hope we'll see you back here in Lugano. It's this really obscure, small, tiny, teeny town, like you said. But we're going to have a whole lot of our community show up next year. And maybe you can time your travel and be here with us as well next year.
Yeah, I think that'd be
Hopefully.
fantastic. My intuition says that you and I will have chai in person in the flesh in Lugano at some point, and we'll probably collaborate on something. We will have a think perhaps on what that could look like, but I think it's quite fruitful in that so many of the students in the Indian wisdom school, they're very much interested in Vedic chanting. We do some chants at the outset often in closing for classes. I seem to have somewhat of a samskara, we can say, or a predilection um, for that. Yet I think you have by far much more of the formal training. So it'd be great to have students come out for something that you were doing, or perhaps if I can make an appearance and contribute in some way and speak about some topic, I'm sure we'll have some sort of collaboration. That sounds fantastic. And the idea about karmic theory stipulates it's so fascinating that in many traditions, in various paramparas, while there is so much kriyamana, there's so much sort of free will that we have. One of the ideas is that the timing, like the birth to death, the kala desha patra, like the timing is decided and the location is decided. And now we understand why. Because how on earth would we ever meet if we're all tied to these obscure places in the middle of nowhere?
Yes, and we needed someone in Montenegro to introduce us.
Yes, we needed somebody in Eastern Europe to introduce a man who lives in Toronto, who's in Switzerland, to another woman who now lives in southern Switzerland. And it's hilarious. And I was saying to Nikita, he had tried to come out to one of my retreats last year in Los Angeles. There's this retreat I do called Between the Eclipses, when the ground has come, and so blah blah blah. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out. He couldn't come. Immigration can be a little bit dodgy these days. And yet I literally met him in the flesh for the first time. It feels like I live with him, actually. It feels like I live in the same house. But I met him in the flesh in the first time, where in Bharata, in India itself, in Uttar Pradesh, going to Shakti Pitas. And I said to him, you know what? Your karma is so good. I can't meet you anywhere but the motherland. this is like this is ridiculous. Like who do I meet in India for the first time? And so it's there's a fascinating circuitry that governs those interested in such things and their connections to others, of course. So you did the whole tech thing, or I'm a rebel. I didn't do STEM. I did 3 arts degrees. Forgive me, Shamyatom. But you did the whole tech thing, and then you were pulled in by something to say, well, let me apply my good organizational skills and pedagogical skills, and plant this seed, plant this bija, and then clearly it's ripened into this fascinating platform called Veda Studies, vedastudies.com. And then at some point, one imagines, you felt the need for resources for students. And that's what we want to focus a little bit on today in terms of this Nitya Pratana. And there's sort of a companion called Nitya Dhyana. Do you want to say a little bit about the auspices, the genesis, like how and why did these works come into being, and sort of what are they for?
So, it's really it's a very long story, but I'm going to try to keep it a little bit short. When I was, developing this platform, Veda Studies, and always my husband had been pushing me way before COVID. My husband had been pushing me to go online because I was teaching at the time. I lived in Belgium and I was teaching. I lived in a French-speaking city and I was teaching in English, and it's a whole mismatch of languages. And so I had a small audience of people who would speak English, and he kept telling me, you need to go online, you need to go online. And I'm talking about 2014, 2015. And so I was looking at these very old legacy LMS systems and things. But my one thing was that I am not going to go online until I figure out how I can create these texts in a good way. That was my main thing, because back then, creating texts with correct transliteration, but even Devanagari texts were at large. There's always, different ways to represent the same Sanskrit word in English, and, the transliteration, even though it was standardized perhaps in the academic world, the practitioner world, and the availability of prayers with accurate texts, with a good font, readable font, that was never so easily available. So it was always something that, for me, I've put at the center of my teaching. It's at the center of my platform. And so having a workbook with a clear English transliterated text, having a clear Devanagari text, a prayerful translation. So not just a word by word, translation that sort of keeps the meaning accurate, but really a translation that brings out the prayer value, as in, why am I saying this prayer? That should be understood by the practitioner. So that's always been my focus. And then I also came up with this phonetic guide on, how the anuswaras change, how the visargas change, and that sort of thing, and how this dvitva happens in the chants, the doubling of the sanyuktaksharas, the dvitvanas. So this is a little bit technical in terms of the chanting rules, etc. So this is what I used to spend all of my time creating before I would launch, a course. And so over the years, I now have so many texts that I felt the need to consolidate it, but also turn it into something beautiful that people would want to keep and cherish, keep in their altars, something worthy of, being regarded as a prayer book, because these prayers are so beautiful. I thought they needed to sort of be homed in something that looked and felt and was produced, by people who sort of cherished all of these prayers as well. So a little team came together. Once the sankalpa is out there, how the universe conspires to conspires to manifest it. And so all these people came, and I pitched it to an organization called Indica, because obviously there's me. I'm just independent, right? There's just me. We say Veda Studies platform, but it's really just me and my husband running everything. And we don't have the resources or the knowledge to publish books and, sort of get it into stores and things like that. And so I pitched it to an organization called Indica. They are an institute for Indic knowledge systems, and they support independent teachers like me. And so they loved the idea. And soon a little team was formed. And so the book designer, they're called Tacit Design, and they sort of design, their design is rooted in Indic sensibilities. And so the team are very into creating things that use, motifs that are very Indic in nature. And then my friend, who's a brilliant Shilpa Shastra artist, we wanted to bring, the artist and myself, we're both from this, studied in this, immersed in this Guru Shishya Parampara. We've both spent decades in this mentoring model, one-on-one mentoring. It's how we've gained our sort of expertise in what we do. And so I thought it would be a really good match to bring someone who has this, very intricate drawings of deities. I mean, I call them engineering drawings because that's what they are. They are the, oldest engineering drawings we have of deities, very symmetrical and very beautiful. They're in the book. And so we spent a lot of time together, this team, sort of choosing the motifs, choosing his images. He made some for us as well. And the cover, the name, the whole thing, the layout, the font size, the readability, how we place things in the book. And so this is, I mean, it was a great, I mean, it was such a wonderful, very uplifting project with a really amazing team. And so very grateful for the experience.
Yeah, it's always lovely when we come across, excuse me, listeners. I've been getting over a cold or two thanks to 7 hours at Indira Gandhi and a 16-hour flight from Delhi to Toronto. But here we are. I live. It's always lovely when we connect with those who are like-minded, especially when those who are like-minded are also here for overarchingly some yoga versus viyoga, and people who are here to bring us together in ways and translate across East and West and old and new. And the publisher for the stories behind the book, as an academic, I never in a thousand years thought I'd write a book with pictures in it. I fantasize about in midlife. There are a couple of historical fantasy novels that I've been wanting to write for some time, but even they, I don't visualize with pictures in them. So but this press came knocking on my door and said, "Hey, I did this course at a platform called Vedic Studies. One of the students in the course shared some of the stories I was teaching about yoga and Hindu mythology to her students. One of her students worked at this publishing house. Pitched it to them. They emailed me to say we specialize in illustrated books, for adults. They're not quite coffee table books, but they're sort of like, if sort of a mythology book and a coffee table book, had a beautiful baby, that would be the stories behind the poses. But the illustrations are gorgeous, and the way the editor was so brilliant. The way in which she went about shortlisting, finalizing the illustrators. She shortlisted, I think, 3 or 5 of them. She said, "I need 5 stories right away." So, okay, fine. Here are 5 stories right away, 5 of 50. She shared the stories with the illustrators all and said, "Hey, we'll have a little competition. Whoever can bring these to life best will earn the contract." So it's fascinating because the person, the extraordinarily talented artist doing this, she has her own style of art, and she basically sort of came up with a frequency, if you will, for this book based on how she felt the stories felt. And so, you have these really fascinating, confluence of rivers that are obviously more than the sum of their parts. So that's fantastic. Also, I've said this comment so many times when we have a satsanga on the Bhagavad Gita. I call it Wisdom Wednesday. We have a Wisdom Wednesday Bhagavad Gita study. All are welcome. I think it's 7 p.m. ish, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And what I say is, however brilliant and sensible and informative the Bhagavad Gita is, that we have to understand this was never meant to be in isolation of tradition. This is a teaching tool for exposition within tradition. We always have to imagine that texts such as the Yoga Sutras, texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, they were composed to operate within the ecosystem of parampara. That doesn't mean that we can't engage them in isolation, but they are they function in a way that a work like yours is much more conscious of, as a teaching tool, as a beautiful visual, erudite teaching tool. And when you open this up, you see the text. It's large enough that you can make out each word. There's space, right? When you look at the font size, when you look at the text, there's space around each syllable, each akshara. You can make it all the diacritics quite easily. You can make it all of the markings for the swaras quite easily. And there's a translation. And so it's delightful to behold. Actually, it's a very pleasant feel, pleasant read. Now, how would you envision someone using this? Would you say that, let me phrase it this way. Who would you say is the ideal audience for this book?
So when I created these books, they were mainly, I had my own student community as the main audience for the book. But really, the book is useful for any teacher or practitioner within the Indic knowledge systems and practices umbrella. So it could be a yoga student, a yoga teacher, someone who's in Jyotisha or is a Jyotishi teaching, could be someone in Ayurveda, a therapist, a doctor, anyone within that range of, a Vedanta teacher, anyone who is starting their classes with a prayer or ending with a prayer, anyone who is utilizing our Sanskrit prayers as part of their work would be the ideal audience for this. And both of these books have a matching Spotify list. And so in the same order as well. Not that you can just learn from Spotify. There is still, you mentioned parampara. All of these prayers, they need to be learned in a systematic way. There needs to be, an instruction that comes with the prayer, with the mantras. You can't just learn by listening to it on Spotify. But for those who've already learned, I've, wanted to create something that was easy for them to be reading and also be listening at the same time and as a practice tool. Also, it is a great tool. This book is a great tool for someone who's teaching the prayers. And so, because I know that I went through that was one of the most difficult parts of my job was creating the resources to teach, is to create the right text that, that I could give to students to teach them the chant. Because, I know, you get these books and they're really not good quality. Always there is something that needs to be fixed. And so, I used to spend so much time on these texts that when I started the teacher program, I didn't want my teachers coming out of this program to again go through that whole process of how do I create the texts and what do I distribute to students. And so I just wanted these beautiful resources available to teachers as well. So it's really multifold. I think anybody who has any interest in chanting prayers will find the book useful.
And to extend the question in terms of the Veda Studies platform, what would you say that platform is for? Who might most benefit from that?
It's amazing. I always thought it would be a platform for people within this IKS, Indian, knowledge systems, people who are in practitioners of that, but I have all kinds of people. So, for example, I mean, of course, the very obvious audience on my platform, my student community is made of yoga teachers, Ayurveda practitioners, many, many Jyotishis, people who are students of yoga or students of Jyotisha, etc. People who are following sort of an Indic, any type of Indic methodology in their life are learning from me. But that's what I thought. But we also have, uh, I also have a student who is, we have surgeons, we have many people in the medical, medical field. I've got someone who works in a hospital in Norway and is using the chants with trauma patients because it's a very effective tool for concentration and awareness without any reminder of anything they're familiar with. And so I have artists, I have people who are just householders, who are, grandparents. I have people who have retired and are using Veda studies as their vanaprastha. And so we really have a really very wide range of people who use the Veda studies platform, but a majority of them are within the IKS sort of realm of people who are in Indic sciences in some way.
Yeah,
Many
indeed.
Sanskrit teachers as well.
Yeah, that's quite similar, I would say, in many regards to the Indian wisdom school. Um, I don't. So one of the things I do is I put on offer insights that are from parampara, but very rare is it that I'll engage in that sort of level. It's sort of one part. It's sort of parampara infused academic kind of grounded knowledge about various texts and traditions. But it's really interesting the more and more that I get to know students, or the more I realize that they're super smart and super spiritual, and many of them need permission to actually embrace their spirituality without having to let go of their intellect or their critical thinking, which is exactly the right kind of student as far as I'm concerned. Um, but so many of them, I mean, I was teaching continuing studies. I was teaching adult learners in sort of Western institutions since 2010, and so it's interesting. So I come at it from the other way, where I'm used to teaching comparative mythology and sort of comparative religion, and coming at it from there and founding the school. It really surprised me the extent to which there were people of such a diverse background, training, interests, primarily in my case, Western professionals of various stripes who have been lifelong Indophiles or are really interested in Sanskrit or are really interested in the Devi, are really interested in really Indic thought, karmic theory, etc. And so it really is fascinating that there are so many people interested in knowledge about Indic thought, but they're interested in separating the wheat from the chaff. They're interested in rigor. They're not just looking for fast food, right? They're looking for something a cut above in their view. So I think it's wonderful that there is the opportunity, because for those who have not been born into a lineage or have had the good fortune of studying in something like a lineage, what are their options? Certainly, I imagine there are limitations to online teaching of in classes, but also I imagine that there is a lot that is very much translatable to that medium. Say,
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, I want to make this observation about, I come from this very, it's a living tradition, it's a living parampara that continues. And of course, one of the greatest things about learning chanting is the immersion of everyone being in the same room and the listening to that together. And it's such an ecstatic experience of that. And so we do that when I offer my retreats and in-persons. But I must say, I want to make this observation that online learning is far more effective as a learning tool for Vedic chants than in person. And I'll tell you why, because, on Zoom, we have to all be, on mute and we have to take turns in practicing with me. And so I get to hear every single person, and we have this homework sort of rigor as well. When people have learned they need to turn in a homework, an audio homework, I know every single student's practice in my classes, which is not something we can do in a fully immersive, in-person event, which we use for the experience of it. So I think both are important. But if you really want to learn Rudram, you have to learn it online with me. Because then I have checked every single verse, checked every single word, every single pada has been checked, every single swara has been signed off, and people will learn it correctly. There's a lot more rigor that we can employ online. And of course, we can reach a wider audience. So that's another thing. And you spoke about how the most unlikely people, seemingly unlikely people, are ready for advanced material and are looking for rigor and parampara and all of that, right? And I want to say that another thing that is really special about all of the classes on our platform is that we have a large number of Indians also studying with me. We have a large number of Indians in India. We also have Indians who are outside of India. And we have all these, French, German, and we have all of these Europeans, US, all of the English-speaking countries also studying, and we're all in the same classes. It's the same material, exactly the same teaching for everyone. And I really think it's because Vedic chant, in the way taught in my parampara, it's with that type of rigor, and it's because the teaching methodology is within the text that we pass on. So every student is having to also learn the rules of recitation that has not really been taught by everybody, not even in India. So we have this amazing audience that I think that people like that. They like that they can see it's the same teaching, whether the student is Indian or not, the teaching is the same. And I think there's something special about that.
Well, 100%, because it is at the intersection of tradition, innovation, and also universality. It's at that beautiful intersection of, this is something that is a vestige and a product of culture. Having said that, it's exceptional in that much akin to sort of the rules of Sanskrit grammar. It has fail safes against slipping out of existence. There are these rigorous. The river has very very rigorous banks, so it continues flowing and it doesn't end up flowing out of existence. And so there's that piece, and then there's the piece, I think, for the first time within the last century, and certainly in this century, that we have something more akin to a democratization of access, something maybe not quite that, but we have a little bit of a leveling of the playing field insofar as, I mean, it excites me on so many levels, because it's so much of what you do. I see so much of my own life's work here, where you're trying to convey something of the rigor and power and intrigue of Indic thought to individuals who are interested from various countries all around the globe. And that pedagogy piece is so crucial. And I didn't actually realize how crucial it was. I had internalized it. I love teaching. I adore teaching various audiences, various levels. But it wasn't until I worked closely, one of my one-on-one clients who's a student is a pedagogy professor, a PhD at an American university. And it wasn't until she started taking courses at the online school, at the Indian Wisdom School, that she was consciously registering so much of what was being done unconsciously in terms of pedagogical strategy, in terms of coaching questions or storytelling, or in terms of, in frame narratives, et cetera, et cetera. And then it dawned on me that of course there's something to be said about pedagogy and Indic thought, because that is the piece that has allowed the faithful transmission of Indic thought. And yet we are not daft enough to think that anything can ossify and remain the same without ever being shaped by time. And so it's this beautiful synergy of something that has been kept faithfully alive for a very, very long time, easily centuries, millennium. that is now being accessed by people from various schools. So I think you're brave enough to walk that fine line between innovation and degradation. In my view, you're doing it well. Perhaps others may disagree. I have no idea. Perhaps there are those who may see people like you and I bastardizing, parampara, and perhaps there are others who would regard us as rendering it more accessible. But I really love the creative tension of because we are in many ways the face of tradition in a certain sense, but tradition, no matter how rigorous the transmission, there is no survival without adaptation on some level.
Exactly. I mean, this is exactly, I think that if these texts have to sustain and survive and be available for next gen, they need to be studied, they need to be learned, they need to be practiced. And so they need to be, the more people are learning them, the more people are falling in love with them, the more that these texts have a chance of making it for a couple millennia more. So that's the idea, and I think it's so exciting to be a part of part of the innovation that is allowing for, I don't know, the next few hundreds of years of how this will evolve and how people will teach it in the future, but to be a little small part of making it available to a few hundred others that would not have otherwise have had access to it is very exciting indeed. And yes, I think it does take a little bit of courage. And thank you for bringing that up, because it is. I mean, I feel like if I'd perhaps stayed in India, it might have been a little different. I feel like you know, there's things that I, perhaps had access to that enabled it. And, just the people around me saying, go for it, go for it, you've got this kind of thing. I had a lot of encouragement. And of course, I had the backing of my teachers. That was another thing. So very, very traditional and very, not something they would do themselves, but really blessed me to go ahead, which I think was a big source of courage for me. I mean, why should I fear teaching anyone if my teacher blesses me? And the Vedas are saying it is for everybody. The teaching is for everyone. Everyone who is seeking. Of course, we're not grabbing people off the street and saying, hey, let me teach you some Veda. It's, if somebody is seeking, then it is our duty to make it available. That is what the Shastra says.
Yeah, that's a rich conversation that comes up a lot. Many students have had conversations elsewhere regarding issues of cultural appropriation. It doesn't so much come up in our community unless someone is asking for a perspective because they've heard X, Y, Z, P, Q. And I liken it to something we can all relate to, food, right? So we go to the buffet, we go to the Indian buffet. The food is made for what? Oh, are they going to sell it only if you have a certain skin color or religion, or the food is made for the enjoyment and the nourishment of those who are interested, right? One might even be able to learn some recipes from the chef. That's different than presenting oneself as part of that chef's uh, lineage, part of that chef's line. That's different. There's lots of space between cultural appropriation or some kind of faux pretense of a lineage. The food is there to be consumed and enjoyed and to nourish individuals. And so I don't see, I mean, I'm sure various teachers will have various perspectives on this. I get asked all the time, can I share this? Can I teach this? I'm like, the stories behind the poses wasn't written for, it was written for anybody who can read English and is interested in this. And, I imagine it would be in your best interest to not plagiarize for the sake of your karma and whatever, maybe some litigious backlash from the press. But other than that, of course, this knowledge is to be shared. What is the purpose of the knowledge without it being shared? And so I do understand a traditional or even insular bent in a certain regard. Dogma is not something I really resonate with, nor sort of, ideological exclusion, but sort of a more insular bent, I understand, because that's whereby the knowledge has been preserved. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. We are not in the business, pun intended, of having sort of half baked initiates around the globe. That's a different type of thing. We're sharing the knowledge, and we're probably having some guidance on what we feel can be shared responsibly by some of our students, which I think is different. It's a very different thing than the degradation of Parampara.
Exactly. No, I mean, you articulate that so clearly and so beautifully. Um, in fact, it's not something I've thought of, the degradation side, because I'm so focused on the preservation and the respectful passing on of what I've learned. And um, and this whole idea of having a teacher program is really um, to help individuals who have communities or who feel this urge to become part of that instrument that wants to preserve as well and share with others, to put some rigor around it and some checks and balances, and to look at it's not that um, it's not about certifying one to become a teacher. It's really about helping individuals understand, where do I need to be with my practice before I will allow myself to teach? How can I start to listen to my own practice differently so that I can get to a place where I have no more unconscious errors in my recitation? And that every single time I have processed everything that I practice so clearly and so well, and it's been heard by others, my peers, my teacher, so many times, that I've gone through this process and I've gotten to a place where I'm reciting something without error, without hesitation, and I have repeatability. And then now, if I've understood this, now, okay, now I can think about how I can share that particular piece that I have, sort of gone through the filter and made sure that I'm no longer, passing on something incorrectly. That's the main sort of sentiment behind the teacher program. And so this, that's for me, that is the checks and balance of any degradation not happening. But we don't do that with everyone, right? Because people who show up, they're all devotees. They all want to express their inner devotion to a particular deity or to just this divine intelligence around us. And so, who am I then to say, hey, you can't learn this? Right? And so, it's my duty then to teach this devotee how to use these sacred prayers for expressing their devotion, because that's the purpose of the prayers. It's giving words, it's articulating this inner longing one has to express adoration to the divine. And so it's my duty then to teach. And so I will teach everybody. I will teach all types of students at different levels of competence, different levels of understanding Sanskrit, and so on. But it's in the teacher program where we focus on how can we, this good, strong riverbanks you were speaking about. I love that analogy you brought up. And that's where we're constructing this strong riverbank, and so that people pass on the teaching rigorously. That's the idea.
Beautiful. I feel like we've touched on a great number of salient features of the quote unquote book, but really more important than viewing this as a self-standing book, that this prima facie book is an evolute of and a support of a tradition of knowledge transmission. I feel like we've touched on some of its salient features along with your greater work and journey. Is there anything else you feel like you'd like to touch on today before we close? Anything at all? Maybe even if there's an opportunity in future or something you'd like to share with the audience at all?
Nothing. I just want to say that I never imagined I'd be somebody who would take so strongly to a prayer tradition. And, coming from tech, and I think that, that's what, for me, the book represents that I think living a prayerful life can be very cool, and that these prayers have existed. They're timeless, right? And so when we learn these prayers, we're connecting with something that is timeless, and it allows us to divinize our daily life, our otherwise mundane chores of waking up and taking a shower and stepping off the bed onto the ground. And in the Indic tradition, we have a prayer for every one of these activities. And so for me, I just want to leave our listeners with this little thought that the Nitya Prarthana really is about, from the time you wake up until you go to bed, the entire day's activities can be divine. And there is something in the book for every occasion. So whether it's waking up, going to bed, or if it's a friend's birthday. So just wanted to leave listeners with that.
Well, thank you very much for appearing on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
For those listening, we have been speaking with Shantala Sriramaiah, who is the lead instructor and the founder of Veda Studies. That's at vedastudies.com. All of the information is in the podcast notes, including the link to this beautiful book called Nitya Prarthana. And I do think I will also include the link to her SoundCloud recordings, which are quite beautiful and may well be a source of education and inspiration for you on some level. Until next time, keep well, keep listening, keep reading, and keep contemplating what happens when tradition meets innovation. Take care.